When you open the Dream SMP tag on Archive of Our Own, you find a lot of platonic relationships. Whether familial or friend-based, sorted by recent or by kudos, it's nearly always AND tags that meet your eyes. Roughly 18 months after the Dream SMP was launched, stats by Center of These Lights based on comparisons between yearly whole archive scrapes showed 18 of the top 100 ships posted in 2021 were of Dream SMP characters, and 16 of them were platonic relationships. A similar analysis covering 2022 showed 14 Dream SMP relationships in the top 100, with 13 being Gen, or platonic relationships. The juggernaut familial relationship known as Sleepy Boys Inc., SBI, that frequently formed the core relationship of these fics, Tommyinit and Technoblade and Wilbursoot and Filza, is shown in the stats to have a staggering 10,017 works posted in 2021, and 7,156 fics posted in 2022. In the entire fandom sorted by kudos, you have to get to fic 31 before you hit a single romantic tag, and that fic is also tagged Gen. If you search the entire Dream SMP tag today, 8 of the top relationships are AND, with the first 6 tags being platonic, and the 7th being no romantic relationships. Entire events with thousands of works posted have taken place, with an incredibly high proportion of works being Gen. At the time of writing, there are 1,393 works that are tagged with MCYT Fic Fight, a popular writing event based on Art Fight, where teams attack other participants by writing fics for their prompts, and 1,111 of them are categorized as Gen. That's 80% platonic. An analysis of a similarly large fandom with teenage protagonists and a young fanbase, Boku no Hero Academia, or My Hero Academia, shows 75,978 of 365,212 works are tagged Gen, or 21% of the whole fandom. Dream SMP's 44,152 Gen works out of 89,155 is sitting at a cool 50% of the entire fandom. Why was the fandom so focused on platonic relationships, and how did that impact the fandom space? I spoke to a number of writers about their experiences in the Dream SMP fandom and the romantic platonic divide. A frequently mentioned reason for the focus on platonic relationships when I started talking to writers was the proximity of the canon to real-person fiction. Fiction written about real people rather than fictional characters. Characters within the fandom share the screen names of the creators, so that a casual glance at a work does not immediately make it clear if a work is about the creator or the character. As many creators had expressed discomfort at seeing RPF shipping, these comments, or boundaries, by the creators were religiously collected and enforced as behavior rules. The fandom was eager to avoid the stigma of RPF shipping by remaining both character-focused and platonic. AO3 writer Chrysalism told me, there was an air of virtue signaling throughout the fandom that boiled down to how good you were at respecting a CC's boundaries, and never ever crossing the line into RPF, God forbid. This pressure is reflected in the metadata of the fandom. There are 10,876 works on AO3 tagged with not RPF, and of those, 3,474 are Dream SMP. 57% of the Dream SMP fics tagged in this way are Gen. Another reason mentioned for the platonic focus was the age of the creators involved, with AO3 user Odaigahara mentioning, I was a little surprised by the intensity of the shipping taboo for some characters, but since some of the streamers involved were underage at the time and the boundary between content creator and character seemed less well defined than Sanders' sides, where the YouTuber in question calls the version of him in the series character Thomas, I didn't find it too unusual. Though the discourse around boundaries and the sheer amount of content creators with varying relationships to fans felt difficult to keep up with at the time. The fandom's tendency towards platonic relationships created a very different tone as a cultural space than other fan spaces that were shipping forward. AO3 writer Beans McGee talked about having had a marked disinterest in romantic relations before this fandom, and arriving with a sigh of relief at the onslaught of platonic content and reads of characters everywhere I looked. Lots more choices. AO3 writer Honeyblock talked about the fandom response to platonic relationships being noteworthy, saying, in the DSMP fandom, I felt like there was a lot more appreciation for platonic dynamics. A lot of family fics, yes, but friends as well. Like, yes, you can write a several thousand word long fic about a pair of friends with absolutely no shipping to lure people in, and many people will read it and leave lovely comments appreciating that relationship. If someone told me that 5 years ago, I would have said they were joshing me. Other writers talked about the focus on platonic relationships allowing them more narrative creativity, with AO3 writer Bones and the Bees saying, "I found a lot more freedom in the kinds of stories I could tell when I wasn't worried about developing a romantic relationship within the plot. I think in turn this freedom ended up improving the way I write relationships in general, regardless of whether they're platonic or romantic." And AO3 writer Sercantus saying, "I feel like there are so many more routes you can take when you're not just trying to focus on getting characters together. More outside factors to let in, other than just the characters thinking about each other and falling in love." AO3 writer Florist Kills said, "Purely from an artistic standpoint, a wider breadth of focus from different creators encourages more creativity, ingenuity, and growth. There's a lot of really original fics in the fandom." Several users I talked to for this piece spoke about how the fandom started to expand the definition of what platonic relationships could be, with Chrysalism saying, "I think that the fandom's platonic focus encouraged some people to think outside of normative relationships. I know several people who learned what queer platonic relationships were through the fan content for the fandom." And AO3 writer Anchester commenting, "We live in a very amato-normative society. Romance is on a hairline trigger. Everyone is expected to be either in a relationship, trying to get into a relationship, or trying to get over a relationship. Having fic to read that displays closeness without the expectation of attraction is nice." While everyone I talked to expressed appreciation of platonic work, several writers spoke negatively about the fandom divide between romantic and platonic works. AO3 writer Catricia said, "This fandom has done a lot of exploration of non-standard relationships, and I think that's really cool. However, I think the bias against ships has held people back and made them frightened of any sort of romantic themes." AO3 writer Bones and the Bees said, "There were definitely drawbacks to this platonic focus. Besides the blatant harassment and threats people who wrote romantic works within DSMP often faced, I noticed that some fans who enjoyed platonic works often had a strange superiority complex about the fact, as if there was something more inherently pure about only reading platonic works. I would see people carrying that attitude into completely unrelated fandoms once they moved on from MCYT, which I just don't think is a great mindset to have." While the boundary between romantic and platonic was vigilantly patrolled in some ways, in other ways it was actively broken down. One of the more interesting trends was the development of tropes that were originally romantic, or which would be assumed to be romantic in many fandoms, being approached platonically. Options as diverse as platonic war prize fics and platonic marriage of convenience fics were posted, alongside platonic adaptations of originally romantic works. Hades Town AUs and Epic the Musical AUs were adapted to now center platonic relationships. As the fandom progressed, the window for what tropes were in use expanded. Some of the authors I spoke to felt that even the idea that tropes could be inherently romantic was a false assumption, with AO3 writer Anarchy and Piglins commenting, "Maybe because I've been reading/creating platonic fics constantly, I've seen pretty much every trope ever already used in fics that have platonic relationships, so I just stopped seeing them as romantic a long time ago. I very, very strongly do not subscribe to the idea that any specific trope or story premise is inherently romantic or platonic, or needs to be foundationally changed to count as one or the other. The only thing that matters is what dynamic the characters have." Expanding on the topic while discussing the similarities between a romantic war prize fic and her platonic fic in which Technoblade is given as a personal captive to King Philza as part of the peace treaty of a war, she said, "To be quite blunt, the key difference, and technically the only difference that matters between this and a romantic war prize fic, is that Phil and Techno do not develop a romantic relationship. If this questionnaire hadn't happened, I probably would have never really considered that No Need to Kneel might be leaning into tropes that the average reader can consider romantic and subverting them. For me, it's just a cool premise to give some M-duo angst in developing friendship." Other authors had similar feelings that the distinction between a romantic and platonic trope was simply a matter of the core relationship. In discussing her platonic fic, in which Technoblade and Philza get married for political reasons, Florist Kills said, "I feel that the real difference between a romantic marriage of convenience AUs and my platonic one is that there is no romance. To me, that's all that it takes to make a trope not romantic. A hug and a kiss can have very different contexts based on if the relationship is romantic, familial, or friendly. The same is true for tropes. The same things can happen, but the type of relationship is the thing that dictates whether it is romantic or platonic. That's all." Some authors spoke about being drawn specifically to originally romantic tropes because the depth of feelings they wanted to explore platonically are usually relegated to romantic stories. Speaking about an unpublished platonic epic The Musical AU, where Philza journeys back to his platonic husband Technoblade, AO3 writer Cat in the Void said, "I adore making AUs out of other media. I tend to pick ones that have an originally romantic framework a lot of the time, but I think it's mostly because you don't find the same themes of devotion in platonic relationships in other types of media. Discussing a Platonic Hadestown AU where Nikki Niachu goes into the underworld to rescue the fellow founder of L'Manberg, Wilbur Soot, Honeyblock talked about leaning into the emotions normally assigned to romance, saying, "My favorite thing is taking romantic gravitas or ideas and applying them to friendships, and just keeping them that way. If the core relationship is between two friends who will ultimately have carte blanche to do whatever they want with their lives, unlike, say, two partners would, even if it doesn't include the other, how do you capture the same sense of weight and drama as a marriage separated by death? By finding the shared commitment and care, some other idea that represents the love there, and tearing it to shreds." Authors also spoke about the freedom a Platonic lens gave them, including allowing them to explore aspects of relationships and narrative that romance sometimes skips over. In discussing a Platonic War Prize fic originally inspired by a romantic War Prize fic, Ancestor said, "In invoking eros-sexual content, the characters get to just skip all that juicy internal conflict and angst and development, for they are in love, and love borders on madness that overrides instinct." Which, perfectly fine if you want a smut fic, I'd be a hypocrite to judge. But as another fic had neatly hopped over a very juicy bit of story, I thought there ought to be a fic about that. Discussing her Platonic Marriage of Convenience fic, Florist Kills said, "The biggest difference between my fic and more typical Marriage of Convenience and such AUs is that mine has a large focus on the comedy, on Aeroace identity, on neurodivergence, and on friendship. As an Aeroace person, I view basically all of my favorite characters as Aeroace. Just like any sexuality, it informs aspects of a person's relationships. I found the idea of exploring that in this fic funny and interesting, as well as the concept of the non-Aeroace partner being supportive really sweet. There's also a close tie between autism and Aeroaceness, as well as having a deep value for platonic relationships, so I explore that a lot in this fic, and others too, as an autistic person." While the fandom still has hundreds of fics posted per month, many former Dream SMP writers are also dabbling in other fandoms, including many that are much more shipping forward. Authors talked about their time in the Dream SMP fandom space as having both good and bad follow-on effects, with Chrysalism discussing a fandom expectation that writing must be platonic, saying, "There were good times and bad times and middle times galore. I will say it left me feeling uncertain about how I wanted to approach relationship writing up until about last year, when I finally threw up my hands and said fuck it and decided I was writing whatever the hell I pleased, because that's the function of fandom. I initially came into the fandom writing platonic and QPR because I like writing about those, LMAO. It was just that the line between how much I was doing it because I wanted to, and how much I was doing it because I felt like I was supposed to, got blurred." And Beans McGee speaking about finding a space for platonic work, saying, "I feel better about my works having a lot of platonic/queer platonic relationships in it, if that makes sense. It is one thing to know that they are important, and another to see a range of platonic relationships treasured and beloved by thousands of people online. I still seek out platonic relationships first in my new fandoms, and read/write them before other relationships in fandoms." Several authors still publishing within the fandom spoke about continuing to approach traditionally assumed to be romantic tropes from a platonic lens. Florist Kills says, "I'm sure many of the things that I write and will write have origins and inspirations from romantic tropes. Fanfic and literature at large skews quite romantic in focus, so a lot of things may start out as shipping dynamics or prompts. But personally, I don't really view tropes as either romantic or platonic. To me, all tropes are neutral, and people can add whatever types of relationships they want to those tropes to make them romantic or platonic. Since I have a primary interest in platonic relationships, I'll keep adding that lens. I'd even like to explore some nicher things, like the platonic Omegaverse, or less humorous looks into non-romantic arranged marriage AUs. It's all on the table, in my opinion." Anarchy and Piglins echoed this thought, saying, "If you genuinely believe there is a trope or premise that can't be spun into a platonic fic, you simply haven't met the writer who is already out there doing that." In some cases, the Dream SMP's approach to the romantic-platonic divide has gone the other way as authors moved into new fandoms, bringing platonic tropes and themes into romance. While writing romantically tagged works in another fandom, AO3 user Otagahara said, "While writing for Dream SMP, I like to focus on ride-or-die friendships and occasionally sibling or parent-child relationships. My favorite tropes and themes for writing and reading were unexpected mercy from enemies, first meetings in what would become long-standing epic friendships, and loyalty or fealty under pressure, so I wrote a lot about Phils and Technoblade. Writing romance now is not really a deliberate change, though, and without the tags, I think some of my romantic works could be read as platonic. My writing style hasn't changed much overall. While much reduced from its heyday, the Dream SMP tag still sees posting in the range of 10 fics a day, with the majority of these fics being tagged and. A quick glance at the front page of the tag on June 3rd shows several examples of platonic fics that reinterpret often romantic tropes, from enemies to friends, friends to family, to a platonic fic tagged with mating cycles in heat. As the fandom moves forward, with undoubtedly thousands of Platonic fics still to be posted and a strong tradition of recursive fic, it will be interesting to see the tropes change and develop. What makes a fic Platonic anyways? Let's have some fun with it.